There is a moment, and almost every working creative person alive today can point to it, when something changed. Not gradually, not over years of slow adjustment. It happened in an afternoon, sometimes in a single sitting, and afterward the room felt different. Maya is a graphic designer in Portland. She has been doing this work for 11 years, building identities for small businesses, drawing logotypes by hand in sketchbooks before she ever opens a piece of software. One Tuesday in early 2023, she typed a description of logo concept into an image generation tool, more out of curiosity than anything else, the way you might poke at a strange device you found in a drawer. 12 seconds later, the screen filled with 4 variations. They were not perfect. A few of the letter forms were slightly wrong, the proportions a little off, but the ideas were there. The mood, the color instinct, the compositional logic she might have arrived at after 2 days of sketching. It was all sitting right there, waiting for her to refine it. She told me she sat back in her chair and just looked at the ceiling for a while. That feeling, that particular cocktail of wonder and vertigo, is what this book is about. Not the technology itself, not the code or the training data or the corporate strategies behind it. This book is about what happens inside the human being sitting at the desk. It is about the creative life and what it means to live that life now, in this genuinely strange and genuinely exciting moment in history. Consider James, a novelist in Edinburgh, who has been working on the same historical fiction manuscript for 3 years. His process is slow and deliberate. He reads primary sources, takes handwritten notes, builds his sentences with the care of someone laying stone. Last spring, a friend dared him to paste one of his chapters into a language model and ask it to continue the story. He refused at first. Then he did it at midnight, alone, when no one could see him. The model produced 4 paragraphs. They were competent. They had his character's name right. They maintained the period setting. They even echoed a few of his syntactic habits. And they were completely, unmistakably hollow. The sentences moved, but nothing breathed inside them. He was relieved, and then, almost immediately, he was unsettled by his own relief. Because the question had shifted. It was no longer whether the machine could do what he did. It was whether most readers would notice the difference. That is a different question entirely, and it does not have a comfortable answer. Or take Renata, a film composer in Sao Paulo who scores documentaries and short films. She has absolute pitch, a gift she has carried since childhood, and she spent a decade developing her harmonic instincts through formal training and sheer obsessive listening. 18 months ago, a director she had worked with for years sent her a rough cut of a new film with a temp score attached. Temp scores are common in film. Editors drop in existing music as a placeholder while the real composer works. But this temp score was different. The director had generated it using an AI music tool. He had typed in a description of the emotional arc he wanted, tinkered with a few parameters, and come out with 40 minutes of original-sounding orchestral music. He sent it to Renata not to replace her, he said, but to give her a clearer sense of what he was imagining. She understood his intention. She also understood that something had shifted in the power dynamic of that conversation, quietly and permanently, the way a door shifts when a hinge loosens. The director now had a rough draft of what he wanted before she had played a single note. She was being hired to improve upon a machine's first attempt, not to originate. These stories are not horror stories. That matters. None of these people lost their work that day. None of them walked away from their craft. Maya still sketches in notebooks. James is still laying his stones. Renata scored the film, and it was beautiful, and the director wept at the premiere. The sky did not fall. But the sky is different now. That is the honest thing to say. The light comes through it at a different angle. What we are living through is not the first time that creative people have had to absorb a technological shock. The printing press terrified the scriptoriums. Photography rattled painters so thoroughly that some of them invented an entirely new way of seeing the world just to prove that painting could do something a camera could not. The electric guitar horrified folk purists. The synthesizer arrived, and classical musicians declared that music was dying. And yet, and this is important, something always survived, something always transformed and continued. The human impulse to make meaning, to arrange sound or image or language in a way that says, "Here, I was here, and this is what it felt like." That impulse has never been extinguished by a tool. But we are not obligated to be naively optimistic about this moment just because previous moments resolved themselves. Each technological rupture carried its own specific costs and its own specific gifts, and this one is no different. The honest work is to look at both clearly, to resist the breathless promotional language that says AI will liberate every creative person on Earth, and to resist equally the catastrophizing that says authentic human art is finished. Both of those stories are too simple. The real story is harder and more interesting. The real story begins with people like Maya and James and Renata, sitting in their studios and their studies, feeling the ground move beneath something they have spent their lives building. It begins with the specific texture of that feeling, part excitement, part grief, part pure animal alertness, the way your body knows before your mind does that something important is happening. This book will follow that feeling wherever it leads, into studios and classrooms and rehearsal halls, into conversations with people who are thriving in this new landscape, and people who are struggling, and people who are doing both at once, sometimes in the same afternoon. It will ask what creativity actually is at its root, and whether that root can be replicated, and what we lose or gain in the asking. Because here is what I keep coming back to. Every person I spoke with while writing this book, every designer, every writer, every composer, every filmmaker and poet and choreographer, every single one of them is still making things, still showing up, still reaching for something that the machine has not handed them. That fact is not nothing. That fact is, in the end, everything. And yet, showing up is only the beginning of the story. Because once the writer sits down, once the blank page opens up and the cursor blinks, and the whole terrifying machinery of imagination is supposed to start turning, something new has entered the room, something that was not there a generation ago. A collaborator that never sleeps, never gets bored, and has read more stories than any human being could read in 1,000 lifetimes. Let's talk about what it actually does. When a novelist or a screenwriter or a game designer opens one of these AI tools and begins to work, the first thing they usually reach for is structure. Not words, not character names, not the perfect opening line. Structure. The skeleton beneath everything. Because the dirty secret of storytelling, the thing craft books dance around but rarely say plainly, is that most creative projects fail not from a lack of imagination, but from a failure of architecture. The story collapses somewhere in the middle. The character arc goes nowhere. The third act arrives and there is simply nothing holding it up. That is where these tools have made their most immediate and measurable difference. A writer named Marco Rossi, who spent years developing narrative content for a mid-sized video game studio in Milan, described the process to me in terms that stuck with me. He said that before his team started using AI assistants, pitching a branching storyline felt like trying to draw a map of a city you had never visited. You could sketch the broad avenues, but the side streets, the dead ends, the places where two paths unexpectedly converged, those took months. With AI in the room, he said, the map came faster. Not perfectly, not without errors, but faster and with details that surprised even the people who had asked for them. That word, surprised, kept coming up. It is not the word you expect when people describe working with a machine. In Hollywood, a small number of writers' rooms have quietly begun using AI tools to generate what some of them call pressure-testing documents. You feed the system your premise, your protagonist, your central conflict, and it returns not a finished script, but a kind of stress test. Here are 17 ways this plot could fall apart. Here are 9 character motivations that contradict what you have established in Act 1. Here is a version of your ending that your audience may find more emotionally satisfying, and here is why. The writers I spoke to were careful, sometimes almost defensive, about clarifying that they do not use these outputs as finished material. They use them the way a structural engineer uses a load analysis, to find the weak points before the building goes up. And that analogy matters, because it tells us something about what kind of tool this actually is. It is not a replacement for the architect, it is a new kind of instrument in the architect's hand. But not everyone is comfortable with the instrument. That is also part of the story, and it deserves to be told honestly. A screenwriter, she asked me not to use her name, which I respect, told me that she tried one of these systems for 3 months while working on a limited series pilot. She found it genuinely useful for generating secondary character backstories and for mapping out episode-by-episode plot momentum. And then she stopped using it. Not because it failed her, because it succeeded in a way that unsettled her. She said she looked at a scene breakdown the system had produced and realized she could not immediately tell which ideas had come from her and which had come from the machine. She said it felt like looking in a mirror and not quite recognizing the face. That is not a small thing to sit with. The question of authorship is not new. Writers have always borrowed, always been influenced, always built on the structures and tropes and emotional grammars that came before them. T.S. Eliot's line about immature poets imitating and mature poets stealing has been quoted so many times it has almost lost its edge. But there is something qualitatively different about the current moment, and I think we should resist the temptation to flatten that difference by saying it is all just tools, all just influence, all just the same old story of technology changing craft. It is that, and it is also something else. When a game designer at a studio in Montreal used an AI system to generate a branching dialogue tree for a morally complex non-player character, the system produced a branch the designer had not anticipated, a moment where the character, under certain player choices, would betray an ally not out of malice, but out of a kind of desperate love. The designer kept it. It became one of the most discussed moments in the finished game. Players wrote about it, critics cited it, and when journalists asked the designer about it, he told the truth. He said the machine gave it to him. He said he recognized it as true the moment he saw it, and that recognition, that act of seeing and choosing and saying, yes, this is the one, was the authorship. Or at least, that is what he argued. Not everyone agreed. Some of his colleagues felt that something had been transferred, or perhaps surrendered, that the surprise itself was the thing a human author was supposed to generate, and that receiving it from an algorithm changed the nature of the achievement. These are not trivial disagreements. They are arguments about what creativity is for, about whether the struggle toward an idea is part of the idea's value, the way the resistance of marble is part of what makes a sculpture matter. I do not think those arguments will be resolved in this chapter. I do not think they will be resolved in this book. But I think they need to be held carefully, the way you hold something that is still warm. What I can say with some confidence is this. The writers and designers and storytellers who seem to be navigating this moment most successfully are the ones who have remained ruthlessly clear about what they are trying to say. the ones who bring a genuine point of view to the collaboration, a specific hunger, a particular obsession, a story that only they need to tell. Those are the ones who use the tool without being used by it. The machine accelerates, it pressure tests, it generates branches and backstories and structural alternatives with a speed that would have seemed like magic 10 years ago. But it does not know what the story is for. Only the writer knows that. And so they keep showing up. Different room now, different instruments on the table, but the same essential act, reaching for something true and refusing to stop until they find it. The same reaching impulse that drives a novelist to the page at 2 a.m. drives a visual artist to the sketchbook, the canvas, the screen. Different tools, same restless hunger to make something that did not exist before. Now imagine that hunger meeting a machine that can generate a fully realized image in roughly the time it takes to read a sentence. Not a rough gesture, not a placeholder, a detailed, color-graded, compositionally considered image. That is what happened when generative AI arrived in the visual design world, and the shockwaves are still moving. The advertising industry felt them first, and felt them hard. A creative director at a mid-sized agency described her experience this way. Her team used to spend 2 weeks developing visual concepts for a campaign pitch. Mood boards, reference pulls, rough sketches, rounds of internal feedback. 2 weeks, minimum, before the client ever saw a single frame. Now her team can generate 50 distinct visual directions in an afternoon. Not polished finals, but genuine concepts, real enough to react to, specific enough to argue over. The pitch meeting changed completely. Instead of presenting 3 carefully curated directions, they walk in with a wall of possibilities and let the conversation be generative from the start. That compression of time is not a small thing. It restructures the entire rhythm of creative work, and it is happening not just in advertising but in film, in fashion, in publishing, in the visual grammar of everyday digital life. Film concept artists, sometimes called viz-dev artists, have traditionally occupied one of the most demanding and least visible roles in production. They build the visual language of a film before a single frame is shot. The color palette of a world, the silhouette of a character, the emotional register of a landscape. It is slow, iterative, deeply skilled work. Generative tools have entered that space and changed the math. A concept artist can now use a prompt to rapidly explore 50 variations of a scene's lighting, or a dozen interpretations of a creature's anatomy, and then use the results as raw material that the human hand refines and elevates. The tool does not replace the judgment. It multiplies the territory that judgment can cover. In fashion, the shift is equally visible. Designers are using image generation to prototype entire collections before a single piece of fabric is cut. They can explore silhouettes, textures, colorways, and cultural references at a speed that used to be physically impossible. One designer described the feeling as having a conversation with an extremely well-read collaborator who has no ego and never gets tired. You say what you're imagining, and it shows you something back. And then you argue with it, and it shows you something else. The argument, she said, is the work. Graphic novelists and illustrators have found their own uses and their own complications. Some use generative tools to block out panel compositions, testing visual flow before committing to the labor-intensive process of finished line work. Others use them to generate background environments, freeing human attention for the characters and expressions that carry emotional weight. The tool handles the scaffolding. The artist handles the soul of the thing. But here is where the friction begins. The datasets that trained these image generation models were built from images scraped from the internet. Billions of them. And those images were made by human artists, photographers, illustrators, designers, many of whom did not consent to their work being used as training data and are receiving nothing in return. The legal landscape is genuinely unsettled. Lawsuits are moving through courts in multiple countries. Artists have organized, protested, and built tools to detect when their style has been absorbed into a model's outputs. The ethical question is not resolved, and anyone who tells you it is resolved is not paying attention. There is also the subtler problem of aesthetic homogenization. When millions of people are prompting the same models, the outputs begin to converge. Certain visual signatures become ubiquitous: a particular quality of light, a particular way of rendering skin, a particular compositional grammar that starts appearing everywhere, in advertising, in book covers, in social media graphics, until the visual landscape begins to feel like it was made by a single hand with very specific tastes. Diversity of vision is not guaranteed by abundance of images. More images does not automatically mean more variety of genuine visual thought. This is where the question of the human hand becomes urgent, not as sentimentality, not as nostalgia, but as a practical matter of what visual culture is actually for. The hand carries history. It carries the specific pressure a particular person applies to a particular surface on a particular day. It carries hesitation and correction and the evidence of struggle. When a viewer looks at a painting and feels something inexplicable, something beyond what the image depicts, they are often responding to exactly that evidence. The trace of a human being who was present, who made decisions, who cared. Generative tools produce outputs, but they do not produce presence. That does not make them less useful. It makes them something specific. They are extraordinary at exploration, at prototyping, at expanding the territory of what a human creator can consider before committing to the slow, careful work of making something final. The concept artist who uses a generative tool to explore 100 lighting scenarios in an hour and then spends 3 weeks painting the one that resonates, that artist has not been replaced. They have been given a longer runway. The designers and directors and illustrators who are navigating this most successfully seem to share a particular clarity about what the tool is and what it is not. They use it hard and fast in the early stages, when the goal is to discover what they are actually after. They step away from it when the goal becomes execution, when the work requires the irreplaceable specificity of a human choice made slowly and with full attention. They treat the generated image not as a destination, but as a question. What is this pointing toward? What does this make me want to make? That distinction between the image as destination and the image as question is perhaps the most important thing a visual professional can hold on to right now, because the tool will keep improving, the outputs will keep getting more refined, more varied, more technically impressive. The competitive pressure to use them will keep increasing. What will not change is the fundamental purpose of visual art, which is communication between human beings about what it feels like to be alive. The pixel is just a point of light. The palette is just a range of possibility. The prompt is just a beginning. What happens after the beginning, the choosing and the refining, and the long, patient work of making something true, that part still belongs entirely to the person standing in front of the screen, reaching for something they have not quite seen yet, and refusing to stop until they find it. Music begins before the first note sounds. It begins in the silence a composer holds inside them, the particular silence that is shaped by everything they have ever heard and loved and lost. That silence is not empty. It is dense with memory and longing, and the stubborn human need to say something that words alone cannot carry. For most of recorded history, turning that inner silence into actual sound required years of training, expensive instruments, access to studios, and the cooperation of other skilled human beings. The barriers were enormous. Most people who felt music moving inside them never got to share it with anyone outside their own bedroom walls. That is changing now, and it is changing faster than almost anyone predicted. AI music tools have arrived at every price point, including free. A teenager in a small town with a laptop and an internet connection can now describe a mood, a tempo, a genre, a feeling, and receive back something that sounds, on first listen, like a real song. Platforms built around these tools have attracted millions of users in the span of a few years. Bedroom producers who once spent weeks wrestling with a single chord progression can now generate dozens of variations in an afternoon and spend their creative energy choosing and shaping rather than grinding through technical obstacles. The promise here is genuine. It is not small. Democratization of this kind is not nothing. It is, in many ways, everything that early music technology advocates ever hoped for. But there is another story running alongside that one, and it is harder to tell without wincing. Consider the working composer, not the famous one, not the one whose name appears in credits you recognize, but the one whose name you have never heard. The one who spent a decade learning to write music for picture, who can feel in their bones exactly where a scene needs a swell and where it needs silence, who has built a modest career scoring short films and documentary series and corporate videos and the occasional indie feature. That composer is now competing with tools that can deliver a usable score overnight for a fraction of what a human would charge. Some of the productions that used to hire them have stopped calling. This is not hypothetical. Music licensing platforms have reported dramatic shifts in how their catalogs are used. Some studios have begun experimenting with AI-generated scores for lower-budget projects, reserving human composers for prestige work where the brand value of human authorship still carries weight. The tiers are forming in real time. At the top, human artistry remains valued, celebrated, expensive. Below that, the middle is hollowing out in ways that feel very familiar to anyone who watched what happened to journalism or to stock photography or to any number of other creative trades when digital tools removed the technical barriers that once protected them. The musicians themselves are not passive in the face of this. They are arguing, organizing, writing open letters, demanding that their recordings not be used to train the systems that may eventually replace them. Some of those arguments are gaining traction, others are not. The legal and ethical frameworks around training data are still being contested in courts and in legislatures and in the court of public opinion, and the outcomes are genuinely uncertain. What is not uncertain is that the people most affected are often the ones with the least power to shape the outcome. And yet, there is something else happening at the same time, something that complicates any simple narrative of replacement. Some of the most interesting music being made right now is being made by artists who are using these tools not as substitutes for their own creativity, but as extensions of it. They are treating the algorithm the way a jazz musician treats a rhythm section, something to play with and against, something that creates constraints and possibilities simultaneously. A producer in Atlanta described it this way: the AI gives him a foundation he can argue with. He does not want it to finish his sentences. He wants it to start them wrong so he can figure out what right actually sounds like. That is a genuinely creative relationship with a tool. It is not so different in spirit from what happened when synthesizers arrived and musicians learned to make them sing in ways their inventors never imagined. Or when samplers arrived and an entire genre was born from the practice of listening to other music so closely that you could fold it into something new. Every new tool reshapes what is possible, and the reshaping is never clean, never fair, never evenly distributed. But the creativity does not disappear. It migrates. It finds new forms. The question that sits underneath all of this, the one that does not resolve easily, is about value. Not economic value, though that matters enormously to the people whose rent depends on it. The deeper question is about what we are actually valuing when we value music. Is it the sound itself, the arrangement of frequencies in time? Or is it the knowledge that a human being shaped those frequencies, that someone's particular life and grief and joy found its way into the pattern? When you learn that a film score was generated by an algorithm working from a prompt, does the music change? Does it mean less? Does it move you differently? For some listeners, the answer is no. Sound is sound. If it works, it works. For others, the human origin is inseparable from the experience of the art. They are not wrong to feel that way. We have always cared about the story behind the music, the struggle, the vision, the person who stayed up all night to get the transition right. That story is part of what we are receiving when we listen. What happens to that story when there is no one who stayed up? The tools will keep improving. The music they generate will become harder to distinguish from human-made work by ear alone. The economic pressures will continue to push productions toward cheaper options, and working musicians will continue to do what working musicians have always done, which is adapt, resist, innovate, and refuse to be quiet. The ones who survive will be the ones who find what the algorithm cannot replicate, not just technically, but humanly. The specificity of a voice, the weight of an experience, the thing that could only have come from this particular person living this particular life with this particular silence inside them waiting to become sound. That silence is still irreplaceable. For now, it remains the beginning of everything. But silence, it turns out, is not protected by copyright law. That discovery has sent lawyers, philosophers, artists, and legislators into a kind of collective vertigo that shows no sign of settling. The questions are simple to ask and nearly impossible to answer. If a machine learns to write by reading every novel ever published, every poem ever filed away, every lyric ever scrawled on a napkin and then scanned into a database, who owns what it produces? And if no one quite owns it, does that mean no one made it? Or does it mean we all did? These are not hypothetical puzzles anymore. They are active disputes, argued in actual courtrooms with actual money and actual careers on the line. Consider what happened when visual artists began noticing something unsettling. They would search their own names inside certain AI image generators and find the system had learned their style with uncanny precision. Not a copy of any single painting, something new, technically speaking, but unmistakably theirs in every brushstroke, every color temperature, every compositional instinct built over decades of practice. The style was there, the name was not on the output, and no permission had ever been asked. The legal question turns on a concept called originality, and originality, in the law, has a surprisingly modest definition. It does not mean unprecedented. It does not mean brilliant or unprecedented or even particularly interesting. It means only that a work originated from a human author and contains at least a minimal spark of creative expression. That threshold is low by design. The law has never been in the business of judging artistic quality, but it has always assumed a human being was somewhere in the chain. That assumption is cracking. When a generative model produces an image or a piece of music or a paragraph of prose, courts in several countries have now ruled that the output itself cannot be copyrighted because no human authored it in the required sense. The machine did not have experiences. It did not make choices in the way the law imagines a creator making choices. It optimized, it predicted, it completed a statistical pattern. Those are not nothing, but they are not authorship, at least not yet, and not by the definitions currently on the books. But here is where it gets genuinely complicated. The training data is a different matter entirely. The artists whose work was ingested without consent did not license that work for this purpose. They did not agree to become ingredients, and yet the legal framework that might protect them, the framework built around copying, around reproduction, around derivative works, was not designed for a process that learns from something without storing it. A model does not keep a copy of your painting, it keeps the shape of your influence, and the law has very little to say about influence. Philosophers have been circling this problem for much longer than the lawyers have. The question of what originality actually means has haunted aesthetics since at least the Romantic era, when the idea of the solitary genius first took hold. Before that, artists were largely understood as craftspeople working within traditions, building on inherited forms, varying the pattern just enough to stay interesting. The notion that a truly original work springs fully formed from an individual imagination, untouched by influence, is itself a relatively recent invention, and most serious thinkers have always known it was a fiction. T.S. Eliot said that immature poets imitate and mature poets steal. He meant that genuine artistic development involves absorbing influences so deeply that they become invisible, transformed into something new through the pressure of a particular sensibility. The machine, in a sense, does exactly this. It absorbs, it transforms, it produces something that did not exist before. The question is whether the process is analogous enough to human creativity to deserve the same name, or whether the absence of a sensibility, a self, a life being lived, changes everything. Many artists believe it does. And their reasoning is not simply defensive, not merely about protecting income, though that concern is real and urgent. It is about what art is for. A painting made in grief carries the grief inside it. A novel written through a decade of failure and revision carries the texture of that struggle. The work is not just the output. It is the record of a consciousness moving through time, making choices that cost something, that meant something, that came from somewhere specific and irreplaceable. A model has no grief. It has no decade of failure. It has patterns extracted from the grief and failure of others, processed at a scale no human could survive, recombined with breathtaking fluency. Whether that constitutes art is a question every listener will answer differently, but it is worth sitting with the discomfort of not knowing. There are artists who have arrived at a more pragmatic position. The photographer who shoots on film did not invent the chemical process. The novelist working in free indirect discourse did not invent the technique. Every artist inherits tools and traditions they did not create. Perhaps, some argue, the AI is simply a new tool, a more powerful and more uncanny one, but a tool nonetheless. The question on this view is not what made the work, but what the work does, what it means, whether it moves someone, whether it matters. That argument has force, but it tends to dissolve when you ask who benefits. A tool does not collect revenue. A tool does not replace the person who would have been hired. The economics of generative AI are not neutral, and the philosophical questions about creativity cannot be fully separated from the material questions about who gets paid and who does not. Courts will continue to hear these cases. Legislatures will continue to draft frameworks that arrive slightly too late to the technology they are trying to regulate. The definitions will shift, the precedents will accumulate, and somewhere in the middle of all that legal machinery, artists will keep making things because that is what artists do, regardless of what the law says about it. What is clear, even now, is that the arrival of generative AI has forced a reckoning with ideas that were always murkier than we admitted. Originality was never as pure as the myth suggested. Authorship was never as solitary. Creativity was always, in some sense, a conversation with everything that came before. The algorithm has simply made that conversation visible, mechanical, and impossible to ignore. What remains to be decided is not just a legal question. It is a question about what we value when we value art, and whether the answer changes when the maker is not alive to mean it. And so the question lands where it always does, not in the machine, but in us. We have spent a great deal of time in this book asking what artificial intelligence can do, whether it can write, whether it can compose, whether it can make something that deserves to be called art. Those are useful questions, but they have a way of crowding out the one that matters more. What do we want to do with it? Think about how photography arrived. Painters were terrified. Here was a machine that could capture a face, a landscape, a moment of light on water, with an accuracy no human hand could match. The death of painting was announced with great confidence and not a little panic. And yet painting did not die. It transformed. It shed the obligation to document and discovered the freedom to distort, to dream, to go places a camera could never follow. Impressionism, expressionism, abstraction. Movements that might never have found their urgency without the pressure that photography applied. The supposed replacement became, in practice, a collaborator in disguise. We are living through something similar now, and the temptation to reach for the same panic is understandable. When a language model can generate a passable short story in 11 seconds, when an image generator can render a painting in a style that took a human artist 30 years to develop, the fear is real, and it is not irrational. Livelihoods are at stake. Recognition is at stake. The sense that effort and mastery mean something, that is at stake too. But the history of creative tools suggests a different way of holding that fear, not dismissing it, holding it, asking what it is actually pointing at. What the fear points at, I think, is not the tool itself. It is the speed at which the tool arrived and the absence of any agreement about how it should be used. Photography came in slowly enough that culture had time to adjust, to build norms, to figure out what counted as artistry within the new medium. Artificial intelligence has arrived at a pace that makes norm building feel impossible. The technology runs ahead, and the ethics, the policies, the cultural expectations, they chase it, breathless, always a few steps behind. That gap is the real problem, and closing it requires something that no algorithm can provide. It requires deliberate human choice. This is where things get practical. There are workflows already emerging in studios and publishing houses and film productions where AI handles certain tasks, generating reference images, drafting structural outlines, producing variations on a musical theme, and human artists shape, select, reject, and refine. The machine offers quantity. The human provides judgment. Neither is sufficient alone. Together, in the best cases, they produce something neither could have reached independently. That is not a utopian fantasy. It is already happening in rooms where people have decided, consciously, to treat the tool as a collaborator rather than a shortcut. The distinction matters enormously. A shortcut asks, how little human effort can I apply? A collaboration asks, where does human effort make the most difference? Those are different questions, and they lead to different work. Policy has a role to play here, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. The legal frameworks that currently govern intellectual property were built for a world where creators were human and the question of authorship was, at least in principle, answerable. That world is gone. New frameworks will need to address questions like compensation for the artists whose work trained these systems, disclosure requirements when AI has played a significant role in a finished piece, and protections that prevent the economic benefits of generative technology from flowing exclusively to the organizations large enough to build it. None of those are easy problems. All of them are solvable if the will exists. the will is a human variable. Cultural norms matter just as much as policy, maybe more. Norms move faster than laws. They shift when enough people decide that something is or is not acceptable. And they have a way of hardening into expectations that even the most powerful institutions eventually have to respect. The question of whether it is acceptable to submit AI-generated work as entirely your own, whether it is acceptable to train a commercial model on a living artist's style without permission or payment, whether audiences deserve to know what kind of intelligence made the thing they are experiencing. These are norm questions, and norms are shaped by individual decisions, accumulated across millions of people over time. That includes the decisions you make. This is not an abstract observation. Every time you choose to credit a tool you used, you shift the norm slightly toward transparency. Every time you push past the first output a generator gives you, demanding something stranger or more specific or more genuinely yours, you insist on the value of human intention. Every time you pay for the work of a human artist when an AI-generated version would have been cheaper, you cast a vote for the idea that the person behind the work is part of what you are buying. None of this requires rejecting the technology. Rejection is not really available as an option, and it never was. What is available is engagement. Thoughtful, critical, ongoing engagement with a tool that is genuinely powerful, genuinely limited, and genuinely shaped by the choices of the people who build it, regulate it, and use it. The artists who will define this era are not the ones who refuse AI, and not the ones who surrender to it. They are the ones who stay in the conversation, who treat the algorithm as a collaborator worth arguing with, who bring to that collaboration the things no training data can replicate: a specific life, a specific body of loss and joy and boredom, a specific reason for making this particular thing at this particular moment. Those things are not small. They are everything. We are at the beginning of a negotiation that will last for decades. The terms are not set. The roles are not fixed. The relationship between human creativity and machine capability is still being invented, and it will be invented by the people willing to show up and do the inventing. That is an invitation, not to be optimistic necessarily, not to be afraid necessarily, but to be present, to be deliberate, to decide with whatever clarity you can manage what role you want to play in shaping what comes next. The algorithm is waiting, so is the work.